The growth in organised crime has caught South African law enforcement agencies napping. State law enforcement does not have the technical expertise to cope. We now speak to Mark Shaw, who is in Geneva. He's the director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon to you.
Now let's just talk about, first of all, the nature of organised crimes and how they've actually evolved globally.
Since around the early 2000s, organized crime has become truly a global phenomenon, so not linked to just a smaller number of states, Italy, Japan, etc. And South Africa has been very much part of that process. So the growth of globalization, the growth of connections, the growth of the internet, a surge in drug production are just some of the reasons that that organized crime has become a global phenomenon with different impacts in different places.
And one of the key things, obviously, that helps organized crime to flourish is having possession of arms. How are these arms generally obtained by these crime syndicates?
I mean, organized crime groups around the world, depending on their type, whether in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, seek to acquire arms, often in bulk. And so you can see that particularly in Latin America, buying semi-automatic weapons in the context of South Africa, sourcing weapons from the state and elsewhere. So arms are a key part of their business model. That particularly relates to types of organized crime who need to dominate or hold territory. For example, to control a place where they sell drugs or conduct extortion, weapons are an important part of how they conduct their business.
And I mean, if we look at Mexico and Colombia, there are known cartels that function there and mafias, and crime seems to continue unabated. Here in South Africa, the Western Cape, for example, has seen a rise in gang violence specifically. Should we be concerned then as a country that the extent to which gangs seem to have free reign is actually increasing unabated?
So, I think it's important to note in the context of Mexico, Colombia, elsewhere, and South Africa, where there are serious challenges of organized crime and gangs, that it's both. In none of these places is organized crime essentially new. It's been evolving over a particular period of time, and indeed that's the case in the Western Cape. And it's a result not only of law enforcement weakness, although that is clearly a concern, and law enforcement corruption, but it's the result of failed social policies in the context of the Western Cape, particularly excluded communities with a history of engagement around the drug trade, for example, but also a failure, I think, to have effective strategies to respond. In my view, South Africa does have a huge challenge and does need to think very carefully about how to respond to these phenomena. The South African criminal market, if I could just say, is much more, is particularly diverse. So and is particularly violent, these two characteristics. So the levels of violence or homicides in South Africa is higher than Mexico or Colombia. Not all of these are, of course, linked to organized crime or gangsterism, although I would say a relatively concerning portion is. It's quite hard to determine what that portion is. And I think that's something to be concerned about, the growth of what you might call gangsterism, a degree of organized crime, the connection to the holding of drug turf, the degree to which this has impacted on police corruption, the connection to politics. So there's lots of, I think, concerns around developing a more effective response.
And when it comes to the involvement of police officials in actually assisting these crime masterminds, is it that crime has actually become, or corruption rather, is more lucrative for those police officers than actually fighting against those criminals?
It's a very good question, actually. And I think corruption in the police generally and in South Africa in particular is driven by a number of factors. The first is low-level corruption, particularly where there is cash drug markets, so where there's active drug markets, as in South Africa, and where there's a lot of cash being exchanged, very quickly impacts on payments to the police or to lower-level police. When there's a loss of, so that's the first category. Secondly, when there's a loss of you might call it strategic direction in the police, and the penetration of policing agencies by criminal actors who are actively doing that. Their job is to achieve protection for the work that they are engaged in. And that includes anything from buying a docket to corrupting the process. And I think that should be of enormous concern in the context of South Africa. Mm-hmm. And in many places, therefore, the response is to have higher level anti-organized crime units which are harder to corrupt, which have particular powers, expertise, skills, etc., to be able to go after, let's call them higher level, sort of mafia-like high flyers. But the corruption of police agencies in all countries with severe problems of organized crime, you've mentioned several, is a standard challenge, I would say.
And then just lastly, in terms of the impact that this organized crime actually has on the community members, you mentioned violence being a characteristic of these crimes in South Africa specifically. I mean, the community members live in fear, and some of them then as a result actually scared to even report any leads that could actually help the police in effectively dealing with these criminals.
I think that's absolutely true. Violence is the currency of organized crime in multiple places, particularly violence when criminal markets are relatively fragmented, as is the case in South Africa. And sadly, in South Africa, if you look at the figures, for example, over the last 2 weeks in Cape Town, just an enormous number of people, in the 40s, as I understand it, killed in low-level drug turf. It barely makes the national media. Now, that's similar in many cities around the world where there's high level of violence linked to activities of criminal actors. So that's one impact. And often it's very poor people and marginalized people who suffer. And because those kinds of crimes are away from middle-class areas, they don't get the attention that they deserve. Related to that, also a phenomenon in South Africa and elsewhere, but South Africa has a particular challenge, is targeted killing. So hits the economy, where organized crime has the capacity, the money to target actors who are attempting to respond or to increase their market share. So violence occurs as a result of organized crime in a number of particular ways, all of it enormously damaging to ordinary people, to processes of government, local government in particular, to processes of politics by threatening local government actors. If you look in Mexico, the number of local government actors and candidates that have been killed. If you look similarly in South Africa, to targeted hits against political figures, business figures, ordinary civilians, etc., etc. And this is a kind of slippery slope which has to be stopped. Organized crime is real. It has important impacts in communities around the world, including in South Africa.
Well, Mark Shaw, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We'll leave it there for now. That was Mark Shaw, Director of a Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, joining us there from Geneva.